You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And we are here once again for another, I hope, a fascinating conversation about some aspect of creation. That's what we do if you've not encountered us before. We would like to remind you, if you would be so kind, leave a like on this video. We know you like it, so there's no reason to listen to the whole thing. Just go ahead and like it now. If you're not a subscriber, please make that effort as well. That always helps us to get the word around about what we're doing. And if you're on another platform, for example, one of the audio-only podcast platforms where we pretty much are on everything, it would be great if you could leave us a review, something like that, to help us disseminate the word about what we're doing and keep up the good work that we're trying to do. So if you enjoy this podcast, do give us a little boost in that way. It's literally the least thing you can do, and it hardly costs you anything. All right, well, now that all that stuff is out of the way, Paul, let's talk creation.
Yeah.
You might remember a couple of years ago, Paul, you were here in the U.S., and we went through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
Remember it well.
Yeah, as part of our episode recording spree that year. We spent some time recording live in the park. We hiked all over. That was pretty impressive for this old guy to get down in the middle of the mountains there. I did pretty well, I thought. Anyway.
Yeah.
Now, part of that episode, we talked about something called faults.
We did.
Which are rather important. We hiked down into a deep cove in the park called White Oak Sink, looking for a particular fault. I'm not sure that we saw it, but we got to the point where it was exposed and tried to have a look at it. So those of you who need a refresher course on that, you might want to check that out. We are going to try to reboot and recap all that stuff. But today's topic is faulting. So we have a special guest with us today, Paul. His name is Ryan Thompson. Ryan has a master's degree in structural geology, and I'm sure he can tell us what in the world structural geology is. And he worked for a decade in the oil industry, so he has firsthand experience with geology. And now he works as a high school teacher online. So welcome, Ryan, to Let's Talk Creation.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to the conversation today.
It's great to have you, Ryan. Yeah, really good you could join us.
Yeah, this should be fascinating. Now, let's rewind a bit here and make some sense of this. So can we start with the very simple question of what do we mean by the fault? What is a fault in the ground? And whose fault is it that there are faults in the ground?
Whose fault? I don't know. Man's fault?
Okay.
Sin? Something like that may have what started this whole process off as the earth decayed. But so a fault is a fracture across which movement has occurred. And so we have two kinds of fractures. One you would just maybe call a crack in layman's term. That's just where the rock is just split apart. And it does that against the least compressive stress, right? So you have an extensional stress that just fractures the rock. And there's been no movement of the blocks on either side. They just simply moved apart. Then you have a fault, which is a shear mode fracture across which movement has occurred. And you have three different types of faults then, depending on the orientation of the stresses. So if you have a horizontal compressive stress, you'll get what's called a reverse fault, in which the one block will ride up and over another block, which is how you get younger sediments underneath older sediments. And then you'll have normal faults, in which one block has moved down relative to another one. And that's because the horizontal stress is not compressive, it's extensional.
Hmm.
And then you have something that's kind of intermediate between the two, which is the strike slip fault, which is where the different blocks are just moving past each other. They're just striking each other and slipping past each other.
Well, that sounds fascinating. So you're telling me that when you talk about rocks, what kind of blocks are we talking about here that are doing this?
Any and all rocks at any and all scales. So you
Any
can
and all
see faults.
scales.
Yes, yes, you can see faults in a thin section under a microscope where you have mineral grains that are just offset slightly. That's two different rocks that have been offset. That's a slip, a movement, and so that's a micro fault. You have faults in outcrop. That's what I studied for my master's thesis. Was going out and collecting these faults in outcrop that may only be, a few feet of slip at most, and just contained within that one outcrop. You'll see the start and the end of the fault. You just notice it because you've got an offset of the strata, the layers. And then those tend to parallel the more regional faults. And the regional faults themselves are maybe a series of faults on the same trend that parallel the larger plate tectonic boundary. So we can be talking about small rocks in an outcrop slipping past each other, or we could be talking about, these plate tectonic pieces of the Earth's crust moving past each other. And they're all doing it in one of those three ways.
So this is where we've got, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. You're talking about stress on rock, right? And you're talking about
Yes.
multiple scales of this. Have you seen a fault? Are there places where someone could go and look at an actual fault where you have like the layers of a birthday cake that have been sort of sheared and shifted? Can we see stuff like this?
Absolutely. Like I said, that's what I did for my studies, went out and measured these things, the orientation of the fault planes, because the orientation will give you an idea of the direction of the stresses. I've driven across the San Andreas Fault where you can see offset in the trend of the mountains there. You can see, I'm sure you've seen old photographs of pictures of fence lines that have been offset after an earthquake, or a road that's been offset after an earthquake. You're looking at the stripes on the road, and there's a big crack across the road, and those are offset. That's a strike slip fault. Put my hand on thrust faults in the Rocky Mountains, in which you've got older sediments on top of younger, so they're very easy to go out and see pretty much all over the world.
All right. So this is not just some story you're telling me. This is stuff that we could actually go and see.
That's right. Not only go and see, but actually derive some use from. A lot of faults actually set up the oil and gas fields from which we derive the energy that powers our daily lives. So,
Huh. Well, that's interesting. So, yeah, you mentioned the San Andreas Fault. You mentioned earthquakes. Now, is that kind of the kind of stresses you're talking about? Because, frankly, when I think about stress on the level of the continent, that makes me very nervous. I have enough stress in my life. I don't know that it would break rocks, though, but hopefully not. But so earthquakes are, so that's the kind of stress that we're talking about here. Do
right,
earthquakes
right.
cause the fault, or do faults cause the earthquakes? Or is it kind of a vicious cycle?
It's kind of a vicious cycle.
Okay.
Originally, it would have started with a fracture and an earthquake, because they're one and the same, right? So as soon as you get that fracture, that breaking, it's the ripple effect, right? The seismic waves that are propagating out from that break that are the earthquake, or that those two rocks slipping past each other along that break, right? And so, which comes first, the dinosaur or the egg, right?
Right,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, right.
it really doesn't matter. They work together. And
They
it's the stress though that definitely does come first.
and the
Because it's the
stress
stress
then,
that sets up.
and that's from just tectonic movements of plates rolling around on the surface of the earth. And
Correct. Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
So I've got a question. So rocks respond to these stresses in different ways. They can also fold rather than fault. So what's the difference? I mean, what makes a rock develop a fault rather than, say, just folding? What's the difference?
It would have to do with what we call the rheology or the brittleness of the rock. And so structural geologists, they study faults and folds because they're both related, right? They're both products of stress. So as the stress progresses, it builds up. And if the rock is ductile enough, if it's able to deform plastically, like if it's warm or if it's kind of a magma that hasn't solidified and crystallized yet, or if it's a sedimentary rock that hasn't consolidated yet, those can deform plastically or ductily, and you can get a fold in that instance. Versus if it has already begun to harden, you're more likely to get a break. And oftentimes what you'll find that there's a fault underneath the folds. So a fault will actually drive the folding of the unconsolidated sediments above it.
Very interesting.
Fault in the granite that is hard and brittle, and then the sediments overlying it being soft and more deformable.
All right, so another part of this episode that we want to mention here, we're not just talking vaguely about faulting. We wanted to talk about a very specific fault, and that fault, well, this is the big fault. I've seen geological maps of the Holy Land, the Middle East, the Levant area there, and there are faults all through that area. But there's one big fault there, and could you want to describe to us what that fault is and where it's found? And I think some people might be surprised, maybe delighted. I was delighted when I first learned about it. But anyway, what fault are we talking about here?
You're talking about a series of faults. You're talking about the Dead Sea Transform. It's a system of faults that begins at what we call a triple junction, and that's down off the coast of Yemen in the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, and continues up through the Red Sea all along the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula. And then it kind of turns a little more north, and you know how the Sinai Peninsula has that V, and you've got the two seas on either side. So it continues up the eastern sea, what we call the Gulf of Aqaba, and then it goes on to land from there and continues through the Dead Sea, the Jordan River Valley, Sea of Galilee, and it actually then transitions to slightly different type of faulting as it continues on up all the way to the southern borders of Turkey.
So
it's quite a large fault.
Yeah, that's a large fault. That's a big fault. So is that why the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba and the Jordan River Valley, is that why they are where they are?
Yes, absolutely. So the series of faults, it's not just one single fault, it's a series of faults, and they are basically the surface expression of a plate tectonic boundary. So it's the boundary between the African plate and the Arabian plate. And it's kind of this north-south trending boundary that then terminates into the Eurasian tectonic plate, right there along the southern border of Turkey approximately. And these two faults these two plates intercept the boundary right around the city of Antioch. The biblical city of Antioch's been destroyed multiple times by earthquakes, and most recently, 2 years and a day ago, with the 2023 earthquake there. It's 7.8. So you've got three plates all right there converging, which is driving a lot of the earthquake activity in that area.
Wow. So is that why the geography of Israel and Jordan and that whole region has always struck me as really weird, because you've got the Jordan River coming off of the mountains in the north, which that totally makes sense, runs into the Sea of Galilee. That seems fine. And then it runs out of the Sea of Galilee down into the Dead Sea, which is essentially mostly dead because it's so salty. And then it just doesn't go anywhere after that. So is that why that's such a weird geography? Is it because of the fault itself?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah, you actually have Israel that sits on the African plate, and then Lebanon on the African plate as well. The African plate extends all the way up to about the southern border of the island of Cyprus and Crete.
Okay.
And actually, just last night, there's been a whole swarm of earthquakes in Santorini,
Right.
Greece,
Right. I heard about that.
to think of 5.2. And those earthquakes, they're just back from the plate margin. So they're on the Eurasian plate, but they're definitely feeling those plate stresses from the boundary just south of them in Crete. Um, so yeah, that side's the African side, and the Mediterranean, is closing up as the African plate is colliding with the Eurasian plate. And then on the Arabian plate side, you have Jordan, Syria, all of the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq. So it's basically that wedge that fits in there south of Turkey between Lebanon and the mountains in Iran. You have these two plates, the African and the Arabian plate,
Mm-hmm.
that are moving at slightly different speeds. So the African plate is moving about 20 or so millimeters a year, which is about as fast as your fingernail grows, about an inch a year. And then the Arabian plate is not quite moving as fast. So even though they're moving in the same direction into the Eurasian plate, they're moving at different speeds, which is then why you have the fault there expressing that boundary between the two.
So is the
How are
fault?
those? How are those rates being measured? By the way, Ryan, how are
Yeah.
scientists doing that? Because those are 20 millimeters is not very much. So, and that seems
Yeah.
quite a precise measurement. So,
I don't know. I have to trim my nails pretty frequently. Come on. It's not the fastest thing in the world, but it's noticeable. So how do you measure them? I mean, you got satellites and lasers and all that good stuff.
Yes, exactly. It's fixed GPS stations that they read the distance to the geosynchronous satellites, the GPS satellites, and they've been tracking that for a few decades now. So we have a few decades of data that show not only, how fast these plates are moving, but in what directions they are moving. And then, of course, in the standard plate tectonic model, they extrapolate those few decades of data back millions of years. Whereas us creationists kind of go, now hang on, you should have
Right.
a lot of data and a little extrapolation.
Right. So this strike, you mentioned different types of faults at the beginning. What kind of fault is the Jordan River Valley? Is that the strike, the strike slip? Is that the shearing fault that goes
Right.
this way? Okay.
Yes, it is. For the most part, it's a strike slip fault, but we have two different words to describe strike slip faults because nothing's quite as
Oh,
clear
yeah.
cut,
Well,
right?
and we
So,
scientists love
as I said,
inventing new words too. So what do you call this one?
absolutely. So I'm going to give you two new ones. So the southern part of the Dead Sea transform, we call it a transform because it's the boundary between plates. At the surface, it's expressed as strike slip faults, but the southern part in the Red Sea is more extensional, which is why the Red Sea is nice and wide compared to the Jordan
Okay.
River Valley.
Mm-hmm.
So the African plate is actually, they're both moving north, but the African plate is actually moving away also from the Arabian plate. And so that kind of sets up what we call transtension. So it's a strike slip fault with extension. So we've got a transform strike slip and extension. So we say transtension because they're actually moving apart from each other. Okay. And so that continues on up through the Dead Sea, through the Jordan River Valley to just north of the Sea of Galilee. Then once you get into the mountains of Lebanon, it actually goes from there to the second word I'm going to introduce you to. It's transpression, which is strike slip, transform faulting plus compression. So it actually goes from extending apart to actually closing back up. And so the African plate and the Arabian plate are actually pushing back together just before they collide with the Eurasian plate.
All right. I think I'm making some sense of this then.
Okay.
So can we put this into a creation context then? We've talked a lot about these sorts of things. Let's talk generally speaking, and then we'll narrow in back on the Jordan River Valley. So generally speaking, continents are moving. Did God make the world like this? Did he want us to suffer through giant earthquakes like that? Is that just, our lot in life to suffer?
I don't believe so. I believe that he made everything perfect and it was working well, and whatever was driving the mist that came up from the ground to water the Garden of Eden, whatever was driving that, I don't think was quite the same as the springs that we have today that are driven by fractures and tectonic movements. You just find a lot of, springs around faults, for example. So I think that this was probably quite a shock when Noah's sitting on the boat and he sees the fountains of the great deep being broken up. And this was, I think he was probably close enough to see those fountains going off and thus, pass along that knowledge to later generations who wrote it down for us. Whereas other geologic events, he wouldn't have observed, right? He wouldn't have felt the earthquakes. He wouldn't have seen the mountains rising because all of that was going on underneath the water, right? So there had been a dampening effect. He wouldn't have seen anything but the tsunamis and the large waves created from that. So we have reference to the breaking of the continents, and I think that was probably when they initially started breaking and moving around. And before that, I think they were pretty well fixed, with the exception of when God separated the land from the earth in the creation week.
Sure. So you're thinking that essentially all of this tectonic stuff has a beginning, essentially, and that beginning is the flood itself.
Yes.
Okay.
That's my thought. And with the model that's currently accepted being what we call the catastrophic plate tectonic model, which instead of the continents slowly drifting apart, which we only have a few decades of information to back that up and extrapolate that, right? It is that they sprinted along during the time of the flood, along these faults and moved very rapidly apart from each other. And we had some pretty sizable earthquakes and faults that are beyond anything we've experienced and recorded since.
Well, I would think it would have to be beyond what we've recorded since.
Yeah.
I mean, if plates are moving, so plate movement, you're talking miles, hundreds of miles, maybe in a year.
Easily. Yeah,
thousands. Yeah, that's more than anything we've ever experienced in the modern world. I mean, there's no analogy for that, I would think.
No.
And do we in the geological record then? I mean, do we see evidence of kind of mega quakes much larger than the ones that we experience today? And what kind of evidence do we have?
Yeah, there's actually one here in the UK. We have what are called seismites, and we can see them in the Dead Sea. There's a great record of them that ties in with historical records of earthquakes in the area. Seismites are where we have the sediments that are laid down gradually, nice and parallel and flat. When an earthquake occurs, they are crumpled and redeformed and convoluted. So we see these zones of convoluted, disturbed bedding that indicate an earthquake happened at the time that sediment was soft before it was compacted and consolidated and lithified, turned to rock later. So we see seismites in the Dead Sea. We know those are associated with earthquakes. We can kind of do some work to try and determine the size of the seismites in comparison to the size of the earthquake. And we see these things much, much larger in the geologic record, including the one here in the UK, which is, some people are like, hey, maybe it was an asteroid impact. But it's, I think, a few meters thick and stretches the entire way across the UK in the Triassic. So,
yeah,
that's a few meters thick. So how thick is a usual? So you mentioned the Dead Sea seismites. How thick are we talking about there?
Just a few inches for earthquakes that are, in the 6.7.0 scale, that range.
And that's thickness. That's the bed runs this way, and then you see a seismite that's this big, maybe.
Right.
So you're talking about seismites that are bigger than I am.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that would indicate earthquakes that are over anything we've ever
Yeah, I
measured
mean,
before. Over a 10.0. They're off the scale. So
they're off the
Yeah.
scale. Can you go off the scale?
I mean, it is an exponential scale, but I've never heard anyone talking about, anything beyond like a 10.0. So
Yeah, I've never heard of anything beyond a
yeah, that's
9
all.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
The biggest one was a 9.6, I want to say, in Alaska that we've ever recorded,
Yeah.
1964.
the Great Earthquake. Yeah, the Great Alaska Earthquake. Yeah. Huh.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's exponential, so I imagine you get to 10, 11, 12. That would be terrifying. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Triassic in the UK has this layer
Mhm.
that is like 6, 7, 8, 9 feet thick, basically. That's all this jumbled, scrambled sediment that looks
Yeah.
just like the seismites that you find at the Dead Sea.
Yeah.
And this is something they've said, maybe it's an asteroid strike?
Right, maybe an asteroid strike. And it's like, that's a very large aerial extent, right? It covers a lot of area to be an asteroid strike, and then
Yeah.
not have any trace of the asteroid.
Yeah.
Seems like grasping at straws.
And we do have, I mean, we have evidence where scientists have said, hey, there's this asteroid that hit, what is now the Yucatan at the end of the Cretaceous. They link that to the extinction of the dinosaurs.
Yeah.
But that was that left a lot of interesting evidence behind. Weird elements that suddenly appear in abundance at that layer. It leaves behind actual cracks in the minerals of rock. They call it shocked quartz. So we can actually see, oh yeah, that looks like the asteroid struck and left behind clear evidences. Is that something that's there in that Triassic scrambled bed? Or is it just because it looks weird and it must have been some amazing thing that hit it?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I haven't actually gone out and put,
Okay.
eyes on this bed yet.
Okay.
Looking forward to it. I haven't been in the UK but a couple years, so
Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sort of familiar with that asteroid strike here in the U.S. And that, actually in North America. That's a really interesting thing. We should probably, Paul, someday do asteroid strikes as an episode.
We should.
That would be
We should.
a lot of fun, I think.
Yeah. And sometime I'm going to have to go out with Ryan while he's here in the UK. We're going to have to go and look at that.
There you go.
Look
Sounds
at
like a
that,
field trip
seismic,
time for you guys.
Yeah.
exactly.
Geologists in their element.
Yeah.
Right.
Sounds like fun. All right, so we're going back. Let's get back to our flood narrative here. So you have evidence of these massive tectonic movements that are way bigger than anything that we have today. That would be consistent with sort of a rapid. I don't know if rapid is the right word for it. Insanely fast. How about that? Tectonic movements during the flood. And that then left us with the crust of the earth that's just full of cracks. Is that basically how it works?
Yeah. It's broken up into various tectonic plates. You have the North American plate, South American plate, Australian, Antarctic, Eurasian, or African. So for the most part, you can kind of think of each continent being on its own plate. With the exception of a few subplates like the African or the Indian subplates. And then there's one big one under the ocean, and that's Pacific plate. So that's kind of a unique one.
Okay.
But yeah, these all have varying stresses within the plates, and they're moving in slightly different directions. So they're all just kind of slowly returning to kind of what I think would be an equilibrium after their sprint a few thousand years ago.
Okay, so things are slowing down then. We're not actually getting worse earthquakes. Is that the idea?
Well, for now, maybe.
For now, maybe.
Right.
Unless something else tragic happens suddenly shocking in the future, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. So should I be worried about my house? Should I don't know, where am I going to move where there aren't cracks in the ground? I mean, they're everywhere, right?
Yeah, they are everywhere and they're all moving. And when you have a large one that moves, that will add stress to the smaller ones that will want to move to accommodate that stress. So it's just a
Sure.
repeating, ongoing process.
So is the ground going to open up and swallow my house?
It depends on what kind of tectonic regime you're in. And so I would say no, because I think that that part of the US is more compressional versus if your house was in Arabia or and you saw maybe on the reports after that earthquake in Turkey, the large olive orchard that was just ripped apart with a huge gash. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it
Wow.
was several tens of meters deep and very long. Just the earth just opened up during that earthquake, and that indicates an extensional stress regime. And that extensional stress regime is all the way through the Holy Land. So it extends down into Arabia, and then you have the East African rift that's splitting the African continent apart. So in this part of the world, yes, you could potentially have that
It
happen.
could you could swallow your house, but my house is probably okay.
Yeah, I would think so.
That's good to know.
You're looking nervously over your shoulder there, John.
Well, yeah. I mean, do I have to update my homeowner's insurance to cover, ground swallowing my house? I don't know. I guess not. So I guess I'll be all right.
As long as you're not rebelling against Moses like Korah did, I think you're probably all right.
I'll do whatever Moses wants me to do. Yep, absolutely. I've learned my lesson on that one. So speaking of Korah and Moses and all that, how about we talk a little bit about the biblical aspect of this? So I guess one thing that comes to mind is, you read the Bible through, right, and you read about let's say Noah and company getting off the ark, and then they go and they move into, they start multiplying and there's people, and they move into the Babel area to build the tower in the city, and then God confuses them and sends them out. And so there are these accounts of people moving around right after the flood, but it sounds like that would be a pretty scary time in terms of earthquakes. Now,
Yeah.
does this fit in with, you mentioned Korah's rebellion? Is that fitting into this narrative of bad earthquakes back then?
Yeah, I think so. I think, immediately after the flood, you would have had a lot more earthquakes. And we find that the type of cracks that are talked about in the Bible are extensional cracks. That's what swallowed up Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and that's the same tectonic regime that we see currently in the Middle East, and it stretches all the way back to the Miocene when the Dead Sea first began to open. So that's when the kind of the incipient, when you have a normal fault, an extensional type stress regime, right, and it starts to open up, you'll have what's called a graben. It's the block that drops in the middle. So when you open something up, there's no support, and the block in the middle starts to drop. And that's why now today the Dead Sea is the lowest place on Earth. It's below sea level, right?
Yep.
But that began to open up in the Miocene. And we know that because the Miocene is where it transitioned from nice horizontal, evenly thick layers of sediment being laid down over the area to suddenly going for 10 kilometers of sediment being deposited in that on top of that graben that the Dead Sea sits in now. So about 6 miles of sediment. So that began in the
Wow.
Miocene and continued and is still continuing today.
So where did that stuff come from? How's 6 miles of sediment
Well,
building up in a crack like that? Where's it come from?
yeah, yeah, it's not a
Yep.
terribly huge crack.
Okay.
And so there's different grabens, and they're all kind of separated a little bit, right? So you have the Dead Sea, which is the deepest one, right, with the most sediment that's built up in it. You have the Sea of Galilee, which is deep, but not as deep, right? And it hasn't fully filled up with sediment, which is why there's the sea there, Sea of Galilee. And then the Jordan River Valley block is another piece of this graben, which has filled up, right? It's now land, it's not underwater.
Okay.
And so the sediment, I think, would have probably had to come from a long way away and not be just the sediment that's eroded off the hills on either side. You have the Judean hills and the hills of Ephraim, and then you have on the Jordanian side, you have hills there as well. It's way more sediment than that. And so you familiar with the Arnon River that Ruth crosses? It's the northern border of Moab in Bible times. And that river is called the Wadi Majib now. And this wadi is considered the Grand Canyon of the Middle East over there, the Grand Canyon of the Holy Land.
Okay.
It's not nearly as impressive as the Grand Canyon in Arizona, but it is still pretty impressive. And that actually it was not present at the beginning of the Miocene. It's a later feature. And so it's this big hole in the ground where you would think that, a lot of that sediment would fill the Dead Sea, didn't happen till later. So yeah, the sediment probably did come from a lot further away. And it just, as the receding floodwaters are receding off the continents, they slow down getting into that deep water as the graben of the rift is starting to drop down and just start dumping sediments from those floodwaters in there from who knows where.
So
And
you mentioned a graben. So the graben,
Yeah.
So you've got plates pulling apart, and they leave this chunk that's now just going to drop. That's the graben, right? Okay.
Yes.
How wide is this? I mean, so the Jordan River Valley has a graben.
Mm-hmm.
How wide is that?
Well, it's a very narrow valley, like 6 miles wide, 10 kilometers, and from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea, which is a small portion of the total north-south length of this fault system, right? That's 100 kilometers, 60 miles, and in the Dead Sea you have that. Then you have the Wadi Araba, and then the Gulf of Aqaba, the Red Sea, right? So it's a big system, all filled with hundreds of feet, thousands of feet of sediment.
Wow, that's amazing.
So I guess you kind of think of this graben as like two normal faults that are basically facing one another.
Yes.
And then you have this downthrown block in the middle, and it's filling up with this sort of great thickness of sediments. And, you're saying that probably came from a long way away. I mean, can we do provenance studies on that sediment and kind of get some clues as to where that sediment's coming from? Has anybody done that?
I don't know if anyone's done that yet, but yes, you can. You can, but I mean, a lot of the sediment is buried underneath the Dead Sea. So for someone to get a drill core down that deep, but I mean, you could do it in the Jordan Valley as well. And I'm sure it'd be similar sediments there.
Yeah.
And you could probably, but you have to have a reason to drill a deep well like that to get down there.
Right.
Science. That's a good reason to drill. Come on.
Yeah.
Inquiring minds want to know. There you go.
Yeah.
So
I guess I was just going to say, you've talked about Miocene, but can we kind of, for the benefit of our listeners, can we sort of put that in some kind of context? Where is that in relation to the flood? You've talked about the kind of draining of the flood waters. So are we saying this is kind of early post-flood, something like that?
I personally don't think so. I think this is probably still before Noah stepped off the ark, just because there is so much tectonically still going on at that time.
Yeah.
So I do like to think of the, looking at Tim Clary's work on the mega sequences as the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary is probably being day 150 of the flood, and that would have represented as what sequence stratigraphers in the oil industry would call a max flood surface. And then that would be the maximum transgression of the sea onto the continents. And then after that, it would gradually be stepping back. And we see a lot of basins around the world that are filled with Miocene sediments. So you've got the
Mm.
mountains that are being exposed at that time, but you still have a lot of water moving and a lot of deposition going on. So where I worked at my thesis area in central Wyoming, the Wind River Basin is full of Miocene sediments, and the mountains nearby have collapsed, so they're kind of undergoing a little bit of extension as well and getting filled with Miocene sediments there. So it's something that's happened in kind of limited areas all around. You have the Miocene sediments that contain the whales in Peru, all
Hmm.
those whale fossils, and so I think that probably a lot going on still to preserve and whale entire whales as fossils and trap that many of them in these sediments. And so
Yeah.
I do look at it as probably, somewhere in the middle of that last half of the flood where you have the waters receding, but the mountaintops are visible.
Right. So, and these are marine sediments we're talking about in the Miocene, are
Right.
they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, the Dead Sea was connected to both the Mediterranean and the Red Sea up until the Pleistocene. So when the
Wow.
Ice Ages
Okay.
started, yeah, there's actual evidence of forams, which are a small single-celled shelled
Hmm.
creature in the Orontes River Delta, which is in Turkey,
Hmm.
southern coast of Turkey, the very corner up there of the Mediterranean. And these particular forams are a Red Sea species that's not
Hmm.
present in the Mediterranean today. So there's that as an indicator. There's the lithology of the rocks within the vicinity of the Dead Sea and in that Jordan River Valley that indicate that there were marine incursions still. They actually call it the Sedum Lagoon.
Hmm.
So, and eventually it lost its connection to the Red Sea, and then eventually its connection was lost to the Mediterranean Sea it was connected through the Jezreel Valley. And that formed what was called Lake Lisan, which would
Hmm.
have then had to been completely gone, at least by the time of Lot, when it was a well-watered valley there, when he went to go live in the cities of the plains. So that, to me, that's kind of our pen. We're somewhere between the max flooding surface, the KT boundary,
Hmm.
and then somewhere before Lot, and the fact that that wouldn't have been a lake anymore, besides just
Hmm.
the two seas.
I
Right.
find this fascinating because one of the areas where I think we need to do a lot more work as creationists is what's going on between the end of the flood and when we get into historical events that we can pin down. And of course, when we're talking about the Holy Land, we've got a lot of biblical data to kind of work with. So we can perhaps begin to sort of put some constraints on things in a way that we can't when we're talking about Grand Canyon or something like that. So uh, it's really fascinating. There's an awful lot of work to do there, and I know Todd, you as well, have also been interested, haven't you, in that kind of overlap that where you're moving into the
Yeah.
archaeological record and looking at hominins in the
Yeah.
Holy Land as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah, this is
yeah,
really
that's
interesting.
definitely been an interest of mine. There's a famous cave in Syria there that has a pretty well known Neanderthal skeleton in it. It is carved into Miocene rock. That cave is carved into Miocene rock. So that's one of those things where I think, well, that Miocene rock must have been laid down, and then a cave drilled into it, and then the people could move in, and then it had to be exposed to the air, and then the people could move in, and then those people had to be gone pretty quick because we don't really have historical records of Neanderthals.
Mm.
So yeah, it's one of those really interesting time constraining kind of things. So
Yeah.
it's quite relevant to understanding the whole history, not just of the biblical history, but of stuff that's just not recorded, that we have to infer from the evidence itself.
Mm.
I love Holy Land geology. I think it's just one of the most fascinating things, and I think it's going to be
Yeah.
really key to sort of unlocking our understanding of the post-flood world, the recovery of the Earth after the flood, both geologically and in terms of the people and the animals and the plants that are resettling everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah, I was just
digress. We're talking about faults. So, you
Yeah,
got
we
any
are.
you got any biblical earthquakes that we can tie to this fault?
yeah, sure. The In 1927 there was an earthquake that basically recreated what happened when Joshua crossed the Jordan River to go conquer Canaan.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do
So
tell.
it's happened more than once in history, and where the flow of the Jordan River has actually been stopped. And there's a place that it likes to get stopped at over and over throughout history, and that place is called Damia, which is called Adam
Yeah,
in Joshua 3.
yeah.
And so what happens is in that these earthquakes is you have the earthquake, it will release sediment and there'll be a mud flow, and that mud flow will block off the flow of the Jordan about this place. It's about 40 kilometers north of Jericho. And then the water will continue running down to the Dead Sea until it's gone, and it'll be dry for a couple of days until eventually the water kind of overtops this natural mud flow dam and spills over and creates a new channel again and goes rushing back down to the Dead Sea again.
And this has happened multiple times, you say?
Multiple times. Yeah, there's geologic evidence of it happening, there's records of it happening, and the most recent one being 1927. It was like a
Wow.
6 point something earthquake that caused that one.
Wow.
Strong
Uh,
enough to then, an aftershock, knock down the walls of an ancient city. So,
well, there you go. Any other? So Korah, and his cronies getting swallowed up. That's one. Crossing the Jericho, crossing the Jordan, taking on Jericho. That's probably related to earthquake stuff. Other things that could be related to earthquakes.
hmm. I mean, I think so. You had Elijah and Elisha cross the Jordan. That could potentially be related. You have seismites that can be tied to the time period of the crucifixion, and where the we had an
Yeah.
earthquake there, and the veil in the temple was torn from top to bottom.
Mm-hmm.
You have seismites that are tied to the earthquake that's recorded in the book of Amos as having occurred during the time of King Uzziah, which was about 40 years before Israel was carried captive by the Assyrians. And that's actually estimated to be probably the largest on the Dead Sea transform of is about a 7.8 to an 8.2, they estimate.
Mm.
And that's
Wow.
recorded. We don't know the exact year, but probably about 760 before Christ.
Hmm.
Yeah, but it would be memorable. I mean, if it was that
Yes.
big, people.
Yes.
No wonder it ended up mentioned in the Bible. Oh, remember the year the earthquake happened? This was about that time. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep.
And then the
And
earthquake at the crucifixion. We know, yeah, that
yes.
tore the temple, and then apparently there was another aftershock there on the day of the resurrection, as I recall.
Yeah.
There was also an earthquake that scared all the guards, and of course, we all know these aren't just earthquakes, right? We're not trying to explain away God's activity in the Bible here, but we
Yeah.
do recognize that, the miracles of the Bible, they do make sense in terms of the sort of tectonic activity there that
Right.
happens in that
Yeah.
area.
Yep.
And of course, Sodom and Gomorrah
Yes.
are
Thank you.
located there too. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Which is actually a really interesting one, because if we're thinking about the time period that the the rift was opening, there's actually a volcano on the Jordanian side. It's called the Sihan volcano, and it's just north of uh, the city of Kerak, which was probably Ker Hareseth. It's the capital of Moab, and it's just south of the Arnon River, or Wadi Mujib, the canyon there today. But the basalts from that volcano, actually, the initial basalt flows flowed over, and you can find them on the north side of the canyon and on the south side, indicating the canyon wasn't there for those initial basalts. So the volcano is actually sitting on the Sakala fault. So I said that wrong, Suaka fault. And it's a kind of an east-west trending fault that comes off the Dead Sea transform, and that's just south of the Wadi Mujib. and the volcano sitting there is right on that fault. And so what would happen is as the Earth moves and under extension and those cracks open up, then it allows for magma to rise and then flood out as then turn into cool and solidify into basaltic rock. So the first one is associated with the initial opening of the Dead Sea Rift in the Miocene time period. And the very last actually shows that the Wadi Mujib Canyon was starting to form. And the last eruption was Pleistocene time.
Mm.
So the kind of maybe the tail end of the ice ages, maybe
Wow.
maybe around the same time when Sodom and Gomorrah happened. So which would have been just down the hill.
Right.
And what's with all the salt? I mean, give us the geological context there.
The salt. There's a lot of salt that is left behind. I think as the sea became restricted and cut off from the the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. So you have salt that's part of the sediments buried deep, right? And some of that has actually been reactivated. And I would say that I would probably call them like a salt volcano because they kind of come up to the surface, right? Because it's more ductile than the surrounding rock, and if it's got a fracture, it will flow up to the surface. But the reason why the Dead Sea is so salty today is because it's restricted, so it doesn't have any outlet other than evaporation, and so any salts that are washed into it just stay there, and then the water evaporates off, and over time it just gets saltier and saltier.
Mm-hmm.
And if you turn back and look at Sodom and Gomorrah, you also join the salt.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there was Lot's wife, and suddenly now there's a salt volcano there.
Yeah, that's wild stuff.
Yeah.
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 Although I should mention, the biologist in me has to mention the Dead Sea isn't quite so dead. There's a weird called an archaeon that lives there. That's what we call a halophile or a salt lover. It's called Haloarcula. So yeah, it's not entirely dead. It's almost dead. No fish or anything like that, but there are those weird archaeons that live there. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I just get obsessed with trivia like that. So hey, the Dead Sea isn't quite dead. Yeah, this is fascinating. So thinking about so we were talking about the conclusion of the flood and the seas that are still covering the land, and we don't know when Noah's walking off the ark exactly, but let's think more about recovery here for a bit as we sort of wrap this up. So we have the flood initiating the tectonic movements. That's basically how the flood gets going. Is that correct? I got that right.
That'd be the catastrophic plate tectonic model we have for the flood. Yeah.
Right. And then at some point it just stops. Is that how it works?
I think it more gradually slows down as the faults kind of find their equilibrium, and so eventually it's not as active as it was.
Okay.
Okay.
So there's a slowing down. So today's earthquakes, today's volcanoes, are they basically was we mentioned, I asked you this earlier, is that the kind of world God wanted us to live in? The model you're describing to me sounds like the earthquake, the tectonic movements, volcanoes, all that stuff, tsunamis. This is all related to God's punishment of the world during the flood. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I personally believe so. I don't think we'd have any of that if it wasn't for the fall of man and the subsequent degradation of the earth.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, so human sin spreads, and then God says that's enough, and we have the flood. The flood initiates all the tectonic movement. Initially continental, what do you call it? Continental sprinting, continental running.
Right.
And then that leaves behind all these cracks in the ground and little holes in the crust where magma can shoot up. And cause all sorts of problems.
Yep.
That seems quite significant to me. I mean, I hear these guys tell me that the world, some evangelicals will tell me that there was no impact on creation of the fall, that the world is exactly the way God intended it to be. And I look around and think, man, that's rough. I mean, if we had never sinned, if we had been righteous from the beginning, and this is the world God wanted us to have, that's a hard reality that we're living in here. And it seems awfully, I don't know, sketchy. Why would God put us in a scary world like this?
Right.
But if those tectonic movements of all that work, all that terror and horror is from the flood, well, then that's a totally different thing. Maybe God did not want us to live in this. Maybe we chose it by our own sinfulness, and so God has cursed the earth.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fascinating. Paul, you got any final questions
It has.
here as we start to wrap this up?
Well, I was just going to ask Ryan if he wanted to mention his book, because I know he has a book out because I've read it, and
Oh, great.
I wanted to give him a chance just to give that a plug. So
Plug that book.
All right. Yeah, so I've taken a little bit different approach for most geologists that like to go back and study Genesis. And because we have a record of the future, a historical record that was given to us called prophecy, right? Someone saw it and wrote it down. I think that you can study that just like you do the historical record of Genesis. So I've written a book about the geology in the Bible's last book, Revelation. My goal being to support the first angel in his message, which I think is the central theme of Revelation, to fear God and give glory to him who made the heavens and the earth. That's Revelation 14, verse 7. And so I think that possibly what we could be looking at in the future is a return to more catastrophic events as a way of showing humanity that geology is not slow and gradual, that God does control and the natural processes. He's the creator, and the geology happens catastrophically. And so we see that a lot in prophecy. Just one example, you talked about the Dead Sea and how it's dead. And yet in Ezekiel 47, it talks about how the waters of the Dead Sea will be healed. And it specifically says that there will be fish of the Great Sea that'll be found in the Dead Sea, or what at that time will be formerly the Dead Sea, which implies that there's a connection, once again, between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, which implies that the Sedum Lagoon is coming back. So,
Yeah.
You can look
All
at the
right.
geology
That's very
and
good.
you know what happened in the past. It's entirely possible to happen again.
Can we buy
and where
this
can
book?
people get your book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's that?
Where can people get your book?
Oh, on Amazon. That'd be the
Okay.
best place to go.
What's the title?
Revelations Geology. Keep it simple.
Oh, that's easy. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us, talking about earthquakes and catastrophes like this and faulting. That's always
Absolutely.
fascinating.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's great.
that's been a very good conversation. I've really enjoyed chatting about this, and I'm very happy to know I don't have to, stay awake at night waiting for the next big one to strike my house. That's good. And I don't have to talk to my insurance agent about adding that to my coverage. Anyway, so thanks for listening, everyone, to Let's Talk Creation. We'll be back in another 2 weeks. Don't forget, we are a donor-supported, listener-supported ministry. If you like this show, please do visit letstalkcreation.org to find out how you can make a contribution to make sure that everything that we're doing continues. So thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Yep, we'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the UK by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.